Hi, and thanks for watching this message video. And don't forget to go through the life lesson that goes with it. And don't forget that on Sunday, the podcast of that sermon goes along with this message video and the life lesson. Like I said, we're finishing our series today called My Testimony to You, where we've been focusing on our testimony to others. And this Sunday, I'm going to be talking about how I became the pastor at Followers Church. But today I want to talk about how I originally got started into ministry. And when that happened, I really did not believe that God would use me. I thought that I was unlikely to be used by God and thought myself to be unqualified. So when pastors at the church started telling me, hey, I think that you're called to be a pastor, I began by telling them all the reasons why I believed that I was unqualified or not to be used by God when it came to being a pastor or any kind of role in ministry. And as it turns out, this trying to reason with others or with God as to why we're not qualified to be used by Him is a fairly common thing when God calls somebody. For instance, when Moses or Jeremiah got called by God, they tried to reason with Him as to why they were unqualified. But if I were to identify with any one particular person who argued with God about why they were unqualified to be called by Him, it would be Gideon. For those who are unfamiliar with Gideon, prior to King David, or prior to King Saul even, all of the Israelites were ruled by judges, men and women. And they weren't judges like what we would think of today in a courtroom. They were more like visionaries or military leaders or people who would help guide and direct, yes, sometimes by settling disputes like a judge, but for the most part, they were bigger and broader than that. And like I said, God came to Gideon and called him, but Gideon began to, first of all, argue or reason with God by explaining to him the reasons why he believed that he was unqualified. Here's what we're told. Judges 6, 1 through 16. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight, so the Lord handed them over to the Midianites for 7 years. The Midianites were so cruel that the Israelites made hiding places for themselves in the mountains, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, marauders from Midian, Amalek, and the people of the east would attack Israel, camping in the land and destroying crops as far away as Gaza. They left the Israelites with nothing to eat, taking all the sheep, goats, cattle, and donkeys. These enemy hordes, coming with their livestock and tents, were as thick as locusts. They arrived on droves of camels, too numerous to count, and they stayed until the land was stripped bare. So Israel was reduced to starvation by the Midianites. The Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. When they cried out to the Lord because of Midian, the Lord sent a prophet to the Israelites. He said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of slavery in Egypt. I rescued you from the Egyptians and from all who oppressed you. I drove out your enemies and gave you their land. I told you, I am the Lord your God. You must not worship the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you now live. But you have not listened to me." Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "Mighty hero, the Lord is with you." "Sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites." Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you." "But Lord," Gideon replied, "how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family." The Lord said to him, "I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man." Now, I'm not sure if Gideon was ever told by the people in his clan or family, "Dude, you're the weakest," but he sure felt that way. And in my experience, when a person feels like they're less than everyone else, regardless of why, it changes the way they see their usefulness to God or to others. When it came to me, my reasons for feeling unqualified to be called by God or to be used by God were different than Gideon's. For instance, no one ever came to me and said, "Dude, you're the weakest." And quite honestly, I didn't feel like I was the weakest person in terms of my family. That wasn't the reason why I felt like I was unusable to God. The reason why I felt like I was unusable to God is because of the things I had said, the things that I had done, my words, my actions. So my connection to Gideon in terms of this usefulness to God was that Gideon wanted assurances. He wanted proof that God really wanted to use him, and that's where I connected with Gideon. I wanted proof that God really believed that I was supposed to be a pastor. I didn't necessarily distrust the pastors who were telling me, dude, you're called to be a pastor, but I wanted to be absolutely certain that it was God who was inspiring them to say this to me. And so, like Gideon, I propositioned God. Here's what happened. Judges 6:36 through 40. Then Gideon said to God, if you are truly going to use me to rescue Israel as you promised, prove it to me in this way. I will put a wool fleece on the threshing floor tonight. If the fleece is wet with dew in the morning, but the ground is dry, then I will know that you are going to help me rescue Israel as you promised. And that is just what happened. When Gideon got up early the next morning, he squeezed the fleece and wrung out a whole bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, please don't be angry with me, but let me make one more request. Let me use the fleece for one more test. This time, let the fleece remain dry while the ground around it is wet with dew. So that night, God did as Gideon asked. The fleece was dry in the morning, but the ground was covered with dew. The proof that I asked God for, I got. And I will explain a little bit more of that on Sunday. And because of that proof, I learned that God was willing to redeem all of those past mistakes that I had made, and that he wanted to indeed use me in order to build his kingdom. And like with Gideon, God did some amazing things in the church where I was pastoring. And again, I will explain more of those things on Sunday. However, after a period of time, the attitude of humility and this desire to be used by God and this dependency on God was replaced subtly with a new attitude in me. For instance, in Gideon's life, the same thing happened, where the attitude of humility that he had was subtly replaced with an attitude of vengeance. And then after that, he decided, instead of continuing on to be used by God in leadership, he decided, no, I'm going to peace out and retire and enjoy the spoils of all of this. For instance, here's what we're told. Judges 8:22 through 27. Then the Israelites said to Gideon, be our ruler. You and your son and your grandson will be our rulers, for you have rescued us from Midian. But Gideon replied, I will not rule over you, nor will my son. The Lord will rule over you. However, I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from the plunder you collected from your fallen enemies. The enemies, being Ishmaelites, all wore gold earrings. Gladly, they replied. They spread out a cloak, and each one threw in a gold earring he had gathered from the plunder. The weight of the gold earrings was 43 pounds, not including the royal ornaments and pendants, the purple clothing worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains around the necks of their camels. Gideon made a sacred ephod from the gold and put it in Ophrah, his hometown. But soon all the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping it, and it became a trap for Gideon and his family. Again, similar to Gideon, the God successes that I had experienced in my life because of this calling changed my attitude from one of humility to a different attitude. Now, it wasn't like with Gideon, one of vengeance and retirement. It was one of pride. And when a person has pride, that makes them basically unusable to God. And so God needed to do some changing inside of my mind and rechanging of my thinking, particularly when it came to both leadership and followership. And I will explain both of those things more on Sunday. So in essence, what you could say is that God needed to do to me the very things that he was explaining to Jeremiah about a potter with clay. For instance, here's what he told Jeremiah. Jeremiah 18:1 through 6. The Lord gave another message to Jeremiah. He said, go down to the potter's shop and I will speak to you there. So I did as he told me, and I found the potter working at his wheel. But the jar he was making did not turn out as he had hoped, so he crushed it into a lump of clay again and started over. Then the Lord gave me this message. O Israel, can I not do to you as this potter has done to his clay? As the clay is in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand. As believers in Christ, you and I are in his hands, which means that God is going to shape every single one of us, regardless of whether or not we feel like we are usable to God or not. He believes that we are. And because his hopes for us and his plans for us are oftentimes a lot higher than what our thoughts are for ourselves, For instance, many of us are going to, like a Moses or Jeremiah or a Gideon, we're going to be like, whoa, you got the wrong person. There's no way. And God's like, no, I've got the wrong person, but I want to shape you now. Let me shape you. And when God begins to shape us, he then will use us. So if God is using you right now because he shaped you right now, my encouragement to you is don't become prideful, and don't let your attitude change to something else like vengeance or maybe thinking about retirement and enjoying the spoils. No, continue to be usable to God by remaining humble. And if right now you feel like God is not using you, well, maybe it's because right now he is shaping you. He's taking you through some things that are redefining who you are in terms of character or even in terms of disciplines. Either way, if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, know this 100% that he does want to use you. And lastly, you're always in his hands.